Hi, Nick Collier here, and this is my shop. Come join me. We'll have some fun. Well, Nick Collier here, and all dressed up and know where to go. So I thought I'd do this little segment, which is kind of a little bit different than what we normally do, which is I talk a little bit and then we get into doing some machine work. Today we're going to just talk. And I thought, wouldn't it be better just to do it outside in the spring with all the flowers and the beauty of spring? So what we're going to talk about today is quoting jobs or projects, and we have several types of customers that I've run into, and one is the customer that knows exactly what they want. They've got the drawings engineered out. They've got everything down to the gnat's ass, and they want a quote for making 1 or 5 or 20 of this particular piece. And they pretty much understand what a machine shop is all about and how difficult it is to get a piece from the beginning to the end. The second kind of person thinks they know what they're talking about. They need a little education. And so what I do is if I get a feeling that they know something, but they just don't know everything, then I'll spend 5 or 10 minutes just kind of walking them through the process, of course, if they're listening, walking them through the process of what it takes to machine their particular part. And it always helps. Usually that kind of person that knows some wants to know more. So the third kind of person is the person that doesn't really know anything, just wants something made. And they need a lot of education. And sometimes they're interested in listening, sometimes it's over their head. And you got to feel that out, because you want to help the customer as much as possible get to the end result without the sticker shock of what it takes to machine a thing. So the third kind of person, oftentimes, because they haven't, all they have is an idea, or they have an object and they want to copy it, that kind of person I just work by the hour. And I charge $100 an hour, and of course it's up to you to charge however much you think is right, but you have to understand that if you don't charge enough, what you're going to get is people who are cheap and people who want a deal. And whereas if you charge enough, and for me $100 an hour is a good round number, it kind of weeds out those people who want a deal. Because I'm literally, when somebody calls me on the phone or sends me an email and says I got a project, almost the first thing I say is I charge $100 an hour. And mainly because I don't want to waste my time. And either they hang up or we go to the next step. So it's important to charge enough. And once you've set your price, don't go back on it. I mean, you can always trim the amount of hours you charge them, but because if a person tries to negotiate the price with you, then what's going to happen is that every time they make contact with you, they're going to try to negotiate the price. So I tend to, if I find that kind of person, I tend to give them a deal by charging them less hours in my quote. And remember, first impression counts. However a person comes across to you, you got to remember that they're the boss. the customer's always right. My tendency is to charge the $100 an hour, let them know up front, and then do a $50 minimum, a half-hour minimum. And that will pretty much weed out a whole nother segment of people that just want you to do, oh, one little thing, it's just going to take 5 minutes. Well, it's not going to take 5 minutes, as you and I well know. There's a setup time, there's, you know, all of the stuff that it takes to get one little thing done. Plus, you want to do your quote on an official piece of paper with a letterhead and the whole thing. It's pretty easy to set up in a computer, and you know, and that way you don't just fire off a oh yeah, I can do it in a half an hour, I can do it in 3 hours, because at the other end, when it's done, you need to have some proof as to what you said and what they agreed to. So always an official looking, professional looking letterhead is a good idea. Okay, now we're standing in the entrance to my wife's nettle garden, and I'm like, you know, nettles? Why nettles? And she's like, oh, nettles are so good for you. They're like, you know, the best of them. And of course, I don't listen to any of that. And a year or so ago, she snuck some nettle tea into my daily routine. And I've always had a bit of a swollen prostate, which means as I get older, I'm having a harder and harder time peeing. And the nettles, bang, took care of it. I mean, I'm back. So nettles grow, grow, grow. Anyhow, a little hint to those of you who are older and having trouble. Fresh nettles are better, but also dried nettles work pretty good too. We had to do dried nettles all last winter. Okay, so there's two types of quotes. At least there may be more, but the two types that I can think of is the defined engineered quote. And that way, somebody sends you an email, they've got an attachment that has an engineered drawing by such and such an engineer. It's got all the specs on it. It's got all of the tolerances on it. Everything is pretty much all worked out. All you got to do is follow step 1, step 2, step 3. And for me, that's the most boring kind of project. But you take them on because you quote it, and if the quote comes through, you got yourself a project. First thing I ask when I get a clearly defined engineered quote or a drawing is this particular piece going to go through QA, which is quality assessment, which means that once they get the part, they send it to a part of the corporation, and a bunch of guys just take the part apart, measure everything, make sure it's within spec, and then either reject it or keep it. And whenever I do a QA project, I do not like it. So my tendency is to back away from those kinds of projects, or really charge, quote it for a high price. The other kind of quote is of a well-defined quote is a repair or a duplicate. Somebody hands you something and say, make another one of those. And that's pretty clear. There, you can take measurements from it. You can, and for me, that makes it really easy because I can see it. I can, fit it and make sure that everything is right. And of course, repairs. An ear is broken off, such and such. The other kind of quote is a non-defined quote. They know what they want, they just don't know how to get there. And those are my favorites, actually, because I can help them get there. And I get to look like a cool guy, and and they get a little bit of help to get to the next step. And, you know, it costs them a bit more than if they had it engineered. Well, actually, probably not, because if they had it engineered, they have to pay for the engineering. So, you know, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. The other thing is a non-defined quote, which means they want to replicate something, but they want to make a few changes. And of course, they don't have any drawings. They just say, "Oh, make the changes." So, you know, that again is a kind of a loose approach to getting to the end result. And I like those kinds of projects because I get to work with the customer. The first type, which is the defined quote, there's no wiggle room. There's just like, you're on a path and you're not going to deviate from it. The way to go about a quote is, there's a couple of ways to go about a quote. Now, I'm sure there's many ways to go about a quote, but I am going to talk about a couple of them. So, you know, you can sit down with a drawing, you can calculate how many holes there are, how long it's going to take to drill them. You can calculate how many cuts you're going to have to make, and figure out the time frame around that. And then I always add about a 20% safety margin, because sure enough, there's going to be some kind of surprise that, you know, comes up that you weren't counting on. The next way to do a quote is to kind of just generally scan the job. And you just, you know, if there's 16 holes that I got to drill, there's, you know, eight passes, you know, all of that just kind of goes into your head and kind of jumbles around. The main thing that I look for is, you know, things that might be a problem, or things that might take special tooling to get to. Those are the things I focus on. And then you can quote the job from there. And I always add 20% to the job, just because there's always something that comes up. And the third one is just, you know, shoot from the hip. Oftentimes, you know, and of course I don't do that with real complicated jobs. But, you know, a job comes in, 3 cuts, drill a hole, you know, I look at it and go, well, yeah, $150. And more often than not, I'm pretty close to the number. And sometimes I'll quote a job at a certain price, and it looks like the customer's going to stall out on me and go the other way. And if I'm hungry, I'll just go, well, you know, I'll do it for 5 hours, you know, and negotiate, start the negotiating process with them so that they know that there's a little wiggle room. The other thing is, if it's an interesting project and I want to video it for you guys, then I'll come in with a low quote. I still make some money, and we both get a great video. So here's a most important thing for good relations with your customer. And that is once you get the job and once you do the job, you do it for the price you quoted it for. And you don't add anything to it, you just do it for that solid price. And for years I didn't do that. I would, you know, get to the end and I'd say, oh, there was an extra hour. And, you know, basically it's whining. And so the key is to not whine about the job. You just do it and get it over with and go on to the next one. And you got a happy customer because there were no hidden agendas, no hidden prices, and you'll get a customer come back. And that's also all about the customer's always right. I bring you back to that place. And the other thing is, if something goes wrong, fix it without whining, just fix it. Pay, you know, if they're a ways away and they call you up and go, well, it didn't fit, you know, send it to me, I'll pay the shipping both ways, and you just eat that. And part of being in business is you eat a certain amount of mistakes or screw ups, or people that take advantage or clearly rip you off. And I've had plenty, and you just kind of fold that into the cost, and it's just the cost of doing business. When I do things by the hour, it's a whole different mindset, because they're not sure what's going to happen, but they know they need to get to the end. They're not sure what it's going to cost, and so what I try to do is make them feel comfortable about me checking in with them on a regular basis. And if it's a small job, $300 or $500, what I'll do is just, let them know, for one, that I will check in with them if anything changes, and if anything looks like it's going to take longer, and then I do check in with them. Maybe I give them a phone call, maybe take a picture of the project and say, well, this part here is going to be a little bit more, and get the okay from them. The worst thing you can do is surprise your customer at the end. You don't want to do that. You want to bring them along as you're going. And if you have to call them 5 or 10 times to let them know what's happening, do it, because that keeps a happy customer. If the job is much bigger, and I've had some jobs that were 10 and 20 grand, then what I do, and if charging by the hour, then what I do is I send them pictures of the progress. And the beginning part is I say, okay, well, you give me a $500 deposit, and when I get to the end of 5 hours, I'll send you some pictures of the progress and send you a bill for the next $500. And then I'll go another 5 hours and send you a bill. And that way, they can kind of feel that it's moving forward, because they got some photos of it moving forward, and that oftentimes gets them excited. And then the other thing is that if you wait and charge them at the end, and it's a $10,000 job, they can scream and yell and not pay you. And I've had that happen. Whereas if you're charging them $500 per 5 hours, or whatever your price is, then they're invested. Each step, they're invested. And by the time they get to the end, where the place where they'll yell and scream, all they're going to be able to do is yell and scream, because you already have the money. And that's so important. Not that they're, I've had a couple of customers yell and scream, but most of the time they know what's coming, and they're ready for it. And by the time they get to the end, there's one more $500 payment, and I send the part to them. There was a project that I did, a couple of years ago. It was like a triple hinge. And if for you, my longtime viewers, you know the project. It was out of aluminum. It was probably about this big. It was a very complicated project. And it's part of assessing the customer's attitude. Now, this was a team of guys, 2 guys. One guy was a really nice guy. He was, and he was the actual contact person that I talked to each time. The second guy obviously was the money guy. And he wanted it exactly how he wanted it. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. Send me another $500. We'll go to the next step. And he would just be adamant that it had to be this way. And I'm like, yeah, all right, I can do that. And there were places where we get all the way to the end of making that particular maneuver, and it wouldn't work. because, you know, it was a prototype piece. And so then he'd have to back up a little bit and go, well, what do we do? And I'd come up with an idea, and sure enough, he'd like, okay, that's a good idea, but let's change the position a little bit. Oh, okay, fine, I can do that. And so we would change the position a little bit, and sure enough, it wouldn't work. Over and over again. And that particular little hinge ended up costing them $10,000. And I pretty much could have done it for $2. But this guy knew exactly what he wanted, and he wanted it that way, and there was no ifs, ands, or buts. And I'm like, okay, let's do it. So that's one kind of project and one kind of person. You know, you want to assess your person. There's other projects where the person's real timid and doesn't know how to carry the negotiating process, or doesn't know which direction to go. And that kind of person, you kind of have to have kid gloves on and kind of nurture them along, which I love doing that, because it helps them get educated about what's going on, and it gets them to the next step of their prototype. And most of this is prototype work, where it ends up being pretty expensive. Now, there's another kind of quote that's very interesting, and that is, and this guy calls me up, and this is the earth drill, 3 or 4 years ago. Big honkin' drill frame with long shafts that, you know, bore into the earth, and I think the drill bit was 24 inches. So, and this guy calls me up, and we talk back and forth, and he finally sends the old drill up. He says, I want 3 more of these. He sends the old drill up, and I look at it and I go, well, I can do this. It's not a problem. And he says, well, I only want you to do this part. Give me a quote for that part. And I'm thinking, well, you know, who's going to do the rest of it? You know, he wanted me to build all of the components, but don't weld them together. I'm fine. Sure, I can do that. So we negotiate that whole process. I come up with, like, I don't know, $6,000 or something like for all 3 of them, plus materials. And he's really happy with the price. He's, oh, this is good. Okay, good, let's go. So I kind of get started, and then he starts adding in things. Oh, but can you do this part here, and can you weld that? Yeah, I say, yeah, sure, I can do that, but that's going to be by the hour. And, you know, it ended up costing him, I can't remember, it was $28,000 for these 3 units. Now, he certainly got his money worth, but had he asked me to quote the whole job as it was, I probably would have quoted it for half that. And so, in a sense, I came out doing okay. And you know, he was screaming and yelling at the end. But again, you know, I just kept sending him bills for $500 every 5 hours. And we went ahead with that. So there's a bunch of ways you can do that. I always ask for a deposit first, especially from pain-in-the-ass customers, because sure enough, that's the customer that's going to burn you. So usually 20% deposit covers it. If it's the first time I'm working with somebody, if they come back and want to work with me again, I don't charge deposit, because I know that they're serious and I know they're willing to pay, and it's fine. So, you know, I do a quick deposit, and, you know, that's pretty much what I have to say about this. If there's any other questions that you have, write it in the little description column, or not description, but comment column, and I can answer them one at a time. Or if there's enough questions, I'll just do another video on another subject in this realm. But I want to tell this last story, and if you want to stick around, it's fine. If not, I understand. It's a nice spring day. Hey, get out and do something. So when I first started my machine shop, I was 18, and I did that for 5 or 7 years. And actually, I started building Harleys, and then it evolved into a small machine shop. I mean, really nothing to scream about, but I certainly made money, and I had a flow going, and I had customers, and I had prototypes, and pretty much the same thing that was going on. And then when I was about 24, my wife and I divorced. I started a new life. I went back to college. I did a year in college, and pretty much lived in the art department. And then I moved to Nevada City from the San Francisco area. Moved to Nevada City, which was about 200 miles away, up in the foothills, and there was nothing to do up here. And I just lived up here just by the skin of my teeth. I mean, literally, I was living in a cabin that was $35 a month rent. This was in 1974. Or maybe 5, and utilities was $11, and I was 7 months behind on both of them. And so consequently, you can see that I was pretty broke. My neighbor was a jeweler, and he kept saying, Nick, come over and make some jewelry. And eventually, I took him up on his offer, and a whole new world opened up, and I started making jewelry. Now, the reason why I'm telling this story is because in the early days, and I went out and did craft shows. In the early days, I take and I carefully calculate how much time I had into each piece, and how much the metal weighed, and how much I paid for the stone, and I would add $35 an hour, which was a good amount back in '74. And I would add $75 or $35 an hour. And so I'd go to craft shows, and I would sell nothing. And I just kept going to show after show after show. And I mean, I'd sell a little bit, just enough to get home and get some food and, pay a $35 a month rent. And I did a show every weekend, the other side of it was really fun. I really enjoyed it. You got to visualize an artist standing there on the street corner with all of his wares in front of him, and how many women would walk up, and man, did I get laid? I can't tell you. Anyhow, we'll go back to that. These days, that sort of thing doesn't really matter much, but it's a good memory. So, I went to this one particular show, and this jeweler sat up right next to me, and usually they don't. The promoter keeps the jewelers apart because jewelers are always there. So he's right next to me, and I'm watching him sell left and right. And I'm like thinking, what's going on? And finally, after a while, he and I got to talking, during slow times. And he said, I says, well, how do you do that? How do you sell? He says, I looked at your prices, and you're selling things too cheap. And I'm like, really? I calculate and I come up with this number. He says, you're not doing very well, right? And I said, well, no. He says, okay, tomorrow what I want you to do is double your price. And then the next day, I want you to double it again. And so the next day I show up, and I just doubled my prices, and I started selling. And the next day, which was a Sunday, I doubled my prices again, and I sold gangbusters. And it's all about making your customer reach, at least for the jewelry business. Now in machine shop, it's a whole different thing, but for the jewelry business, it's about making them reach because it's a fantasy, and they're reaching for the fantasy and they want to bring it back into their life. I was an auto mechanic for a number of years at one point, and basically we're dealing with people's problems, and most people have no idea how to deal with their problems. And so who do they blame? The mechanic. So being in the jewelry industry was a delight. And so I literally every year I would do this one particular show that I met this guy at, and I would add 20% to my price every year. And sure enough, I'd sell more, and I'd have to work less. Hey, this has been fun. Any questions, put something down in the comment. This is Nick Collier, checking out.